Hey, this is Jamey with Stonemeyer Games, and today I'm going to do something a little special, something I've only done for one other game so far, and that is I'm going to do a deep dive into role-player adventures and talk about the 10 things, the top 10 things that I learned from playing this truly amazing campaign game. This is a cooperative campaign game. I played it with two players. My character was a Laika, I believe. It was a puffin-style creature that I used. And we did not play in legendary mode, in case you know that the legendary mode can make it a little harder. We didn't play in that mode. Um, and we played all 11 scenarios. There are kind of 10 scenarios and a big finale, a final scenario. And we played it over the course of a couple of weeks. Probably took us around 20 to 25 hours, I would say. The heart of the game is that it is a storybook game, a scenario-driven storybook game with an ongoing story that connects from scenario to scenario. You always play the scenarios in the same order, but there are a lot of variable things that can happen along the way. And there are skill tests and combat as you go through these adventures. That involve rolling dice and trying to place specific numbers dice and color dice, and oftentimes dice of a specific color and number on a little track. Looks like this. And you're trying to accomplish those skill tests. And so all the cards that you're gathering in the game make you better at doing this type of skill tests and this type of combat. That's a quick overview of what the game is. Let me jump in and just talk about it. And mostly I'm going to just rave about this game and all the mechanisms that I think are so brilliant in this game. There are a few little design lessons I learned, things that I maybe would tweak a little bit, but I'm not really trying to redesign this game because this is probably the best campaign game that I've ever played, probably the best cooperative campaign game that I've ever played, and probably definitely the best cooperative adventure campaign game that I've ever played. Depends on how deep I want to go into those categories. I highly, highly recommend it. And I'm going to avoid spoilers in this chat here. I think very minor things might come up, but I will try to avoid that so you have the full unspoiled experience of role-player adventures. So the first category is learning, retention, and memory. So there's a lot of things the game does to make it easy to pick up and learn and easy to come back to after a couple days, a couple weeks. We didn't wait weeks or months to play again. We didn't want to, but I could see it being very easy to get back into the swing of it after playing. And very easy, the game does some clever things to help you remember what has happened so far, because a lot of stuff can happen in this game. In terms of learning the game, the first scenario is very interesting. So there's a rule book. You just sit down and read the rule book like any other game. However, the first scenario in the game is cleverly and sneakily a tutorial. And I didn't really even realize that until I was actually playing it. I don't remember the game ever saying that the first chapter is actually a tutorial. Let's see if I have it handy here. Because you have a rule book and you have the first scenario. Yeah, here we go. Here's Adventure 1, Battle at Black Lake. And it's just called Adventure 1, it's like any other adventure in the book. However, as we were playing it, I was like, oh, this is designed to help us, to kind of ease us into the game. And A, I love how that scenario is designed to do that. And B, I love that it wasn't called a tutorial, because I think sometimes that might make players feel like it doesn't matter, that scenario doesn't matter. But this scenario does matter. It has an impact on the story. It just maybe has a little bit of a smaller impact on the story because it's easing you into this greater campaign. I thought that was really clever. There are reference cards that come with the game, very detailed reference cards, specifically going into what happens during a skill check or combat. Let's see if I can find them. Yeah, here they are. So here's the skill check, and here's the combat. There are only 4 of these cards in the game, and so which was nice to have to be playing 2 players, because we could have one on the front side, one on the back side in front of us. And we used these for like half of the first scenario, and then we never looked at them again. Because, even though they're great, so I'm glad they're included, but the game was so intuitive once you got into the flow of how these different things work, how this combat and skill checks works, that we never had to return to them. So that, I think, speaks to how well the game is designed, that it was very intuitive once you got into the flow of the game. You didn't have to reference the reference cards. One other aspect of learning, retention, and memory that I really appreciate, and let's see if I can show this to you a little bit. No, I don't want to spoil anything, so I won't show it to you, but basically, everything that you can do in the game is always told to you in the storybook itself, whether it's for that scenario or the general encounter storybook. So you'll encounter something, you'll read through a passage, and then at the end of that passage, it'll say, here's what you can do, here are your options. And sometimes those options are very specific to that story, and sometimes maybe you've completed that little part of the story, and it'll say, okay, you can rest now, you can use an item now, you can move to another location now. And I thought this was amazing that all that information was always in the book. You'd never had to refer to someplace else to remember what you were allowed to do at that moment. And there was never any doubt as to what you were allowed to do in that moment because the storybook always told you your options. That I thought was absolutely wonderful. It was so little mental overhead to worry about like what we were allowed to do or what we could do because the storybook could always tell us. And that let us focus on the story and focus on the interesting decisions we were trying to make in the game. Last, in terms of memory, the game does a fantastic job of reminding you about what's happened so far, and in a couple different ways. So one, at the end of each scenario, there's this section called The End, and it looks at different keywords you've gathered, different titles that you've gathered during that scenario, and it'll tell you, here's what you did. And here's the impact on what you did based on this title. So it kind of reminds you of what just happened. Then at the beginning of every scenario, it also reminds you, and now in addition to like setting the scene for what's about to happen, it also reminds you about some of the bigger decisions you've already made. And last, you have this big pile of title cards. Again, I don't want to spoil any of the title cards, but the title cards are a really big part of the game. And they are things like, they'll say, they'll have a title like you killed this person, say. And there isn't a lot of killing in the game, but it might say that you killed this person, specific person's name, and then in a little passage of text, it'll remind you of how that happened and what happened there. So the game, in multiple ways, is acknowledging that you might be playing this campaign over multiple weeks or months, and you might forget what's happened. Even with us playing over the course of 2 weeks, over maybe 3 weekends, we still forgot a few little things here and there, even though the game was very good at not helping us do that. But the game had all these different ways of helping us remember what was going on. I thought that was really, really awesome. Great game design for a game with an ongoing story. The next section I want to talk about is our skill test and combat. So, a very brief version of how the skill tests work are you have, so here, I'm going to just hold up this one. Let's see if you can see that. So there's 4 different levels here because difficulty scales. I'll talk about difficulty in a minute. But early on in the game, you'll encounter the skill test. This is a charm skill test, and you'll need to put a purple die of number 3. You need to put a white die, number 2. You need to put either a white die or a purple die with a number 4 right there. That system is very simple. It lets the game have a bunch of different cards to help you with dice manipulation. And the combat is very similar to that. So I like just the basics of how that works. Very basic to understand. I also really like that this is a big skill test book. There are lots of different things. You can charm, you can conceal, you can do speechcraft. There are all these different things. There's like 20 pages in this book of different things that you can do. So I like that it wasn't just one default skill test. There are a wide variety of different ways to do these skill tests. And combat was very similar to that. I like there's often a choice in the game between whether you're doing a skill test or combat. That I thought was huge. I mean, that is what I've been looking for in an adventure game. Too often it's like, okay, you are entering combat now, or you are entering a skill test. It's one or the other. Now in this game, and usually it leans towards combat. Usually these games are all about like the only option you can do is fight. Not so in this game. In this game, there are often multiple choices, and among them were often either combat or like fight the creature, or convince them that you are friendly. That type of thing. That I thought was really, really wonderful to have that choice. There's no spatial aspect in this game. So I do appreciate there are some games in this style of game, dungeon crawl style games almost, where the spatial aspect is really important, like where your character actually is in relation to the enemies. There's nothing like that here, and that was okay. It's just a different puzzle, and I really like that puzzle. I like that there was no setting up of every combat. You just flip to the page and go. Really, really easy to get into each combat or each skill test. One thing that I really liked here, I'll show you like one enemy here so you can see what it looks like. But in the skill test book, you can see these cubes under here. And what that is saying is, even if you don't complete the skill check, because it's an all or nothing thing. For you to complete the skill check, you need to put all 3 of these dice down here. But say you can only put, maybe if you're really weak early in the game, you only end up being able to put 1 white 6 down here. You can't put the other dice. When you do that, you still gain an XP. You gain an experience point, which you can use to spend at the end of the scenario. That was really nice. So it gives you a choice, even in a skill check that you are losing, or that you can still go after a few of these dice to get some XP to advance you in the game in a different way. I thought that was clever. And in combat, let's see if I can show you an example. I don't want to spoil anything, but here's a rat folk. I can show you that. You can see on the rat folk under some of these dice are coins too. So as you kind of hit these enemies a little bit, you get coins or XP. The coin is over on the white die over there. So I like that. I really like that there are kind of partial victories in skill tests. One element of the combat cards that I really like, and these are even used in different ways, are the modifier cards. This is a brilliant addition to the game. So I showed you that rat folk a second ago, but depending on what has happened in your story so far, you might encounter a weakened rat folk. The game might say, pull out this modifier card, the weakened modifier card, and they'll be weakened. Or it might say, they are, it's a band of rat folk. So you're encountering a bunch of those rat folk. And oftentimes these are tied to the story, where maybe in that case you've injured that rat folk at some time in this scenario. The storybook will remember that based on maybe a keyword that it gave you, and then later on in the story, when you encounter that rat folk again, it's weakened then, and so you have a weakened modifier in that, and that it just adds a ton of variety to these monsters, because not only are they monsters or people, things that you're attacking, not always monsters, but they have modifiers that change up the rules of that combat just a little bit. And it's just like one little card of instructions. I thought that was really, really clever. One little observation I have about the skill test is that you have all these cards that you're using to manipulate numbers and numbers and colors. So that's the main thing. Actually, 3 categories. 1, you're getting more dice during a skill test based on a card that you have. 2, you are manipulating the color of a die, you're changing the color. And 3, you're manipulating the number. And of all those, I noticed that re-rolling was the thing that we kind of avoided the most. We were typically hesitant to use a card to re-roll 1 die, because we weren't able, you had a limit to the number of cards that you were able to play. So it was just kind of an interesting observation in a game with dice manipulation, how re-rolling was way down on the ladder compared to those other more agency-filled dice manipulation aspects. And last, about the skill test in combat, all these cards that I'm mentioning here, I'm kind of gesturing to my right here because that's where I kept them on the table. They were always available to me. They're all faced up on the table. It's not like a deck of cards where you randomly reveal some cards and those are the cards, those are your skills or your weapons that you can use that combat. No, of course not. That doesn't make sense thematically. You have all these weapons at your disposal. You have all these abilities at your disposal. You get to decide which of those you actually get to use in each skill test or combat. I really, really like that. It did end up taking up a lot of table space, so we had this game out on the table, sprawling on the table, but that was okay. It looked cool on the table. The third category is difficulty, scaling, and failing. So I showed you a second ago these different skill tests. These are all like Thiefcraft skill tests here, but as the game advances, the storybook will say, okay, you are now doing, like in scenarios 3 and 4, say, you are now doing the level 2 skill tests. And so you need more dice here, but it also lets you roll more dice. You're rolling typically, I believe, so this one you're rolling 2 more dice, no, 1 more die than you actually need to place here. And then, because by the end of the game, you have cards that will help you get more dice. And so on until the end. In the last few scenarios, we were having to fill all of these spaces to accomplish the skill tests. So I thought that was a really nice way to level up the difficulty throughout the game. And same with player count. I don't think we played with 2 players, and that was a good player count, really good player count. But I don't think scaling up to more players would have that big of an impact on the game. I thought the core scaling system of how many dice you can roll in the combat as a group, because you're going into these challenges as a group, whether it's combat or skill test, it scaled really well that way. So one major point of discussion I wanted to mention here is that there were a few moments in the game where we chose a skill test and we were about to fail, and we really just did not want to fail. And this is a little hard to describe. It took me a while to figure out, to pinpoint exactly what was going on here, because and I think it's because the story of this game is so strong and your decisions really matter, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And so we might make a crucially thematic decision in the game. We might decide, say, we're not going to attack this creature. We are going to try our best to befriend them. And the game does a pretty good job, even if you fail. Like, you try to befriend them. Oftentimes, the storybook will say, the creature can tell that you tried to befriend them. You did your best, but you didn't succeed. They don't believe you, and so they run away. But there were a few story points in the game that where it mattered so much for us to have our decision matter and not be dependent on us being successful in the skill test, that even though we were we were typically 1 die away, we were going to fail that skill test. And we would just say, we passed, which I think is our right to do as gamers. I didn't love doing that. It didn't feel great to do that because I knew we were cheating a little bit, but it was just something that I really tried to that I observed as we were playing, that it was interesting to have a game when the game is so thematic and your decisions matter as much as they do in role player adventures, that that I don't know, sometimes you kind of just need to give players almost a guaranteed success, but degrees of that success, because I don't know, sometimes those decisions just have a really big impact on the game. I'm not explaining this very well. It's a little hard to explain, but it was just very interesting to observe that as we were playing the game. Aside that, there's no real win or lose condition to this game, which I really love. Like, I didn't even notice that as we were playing. Like, there was no point in any mission where it said you have failed this mission. You lost the scenario. And there's also no point in any scenario where it says you won. Either way, you get to the end of the scenario. You are going to get to the end of the scenario, and you get to learn what happened, or not learn what happened, but the game kind of, again, reminds you of what you did. So it shows you the impact of your consequences and your decisions. It feels more real that way than any other adventure game because the game isn't telling us what a win or a loss is. We're deciding what's important to us in the game. We're deciding what we want to do, what we want to try to do, where we want to go, those types of things within each scenario. I love that. And in addition to that, one last thing on this point, because there's no failing, there's no losing a scenario, you're always moving forward. You are never having to repeat a scenario here, which in a story-driven game, I think would be terrible for a game to do that in this day and age. For a story-driven game to say, oh, you need to repeat that scenario now, that just doesn't make sense. Like, you've done these things, there should be consequences to those things, but you shouldn't have to repeat them, in my opinion. And I think role-player adventures realized that. I'm sure maybe Keith realized that very early on in the design process, that that players would care much more about the consequences of their actions than have this false sense of, oh, we lost this scenario, we have to repeat it now, we have to repeat this story. It just doesn't make sense thematically. So I love the game doesn't do that. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about what failure can feel like in the game, and that is in the sense of resting and exhaustion. So there are ways in combat where you can essentially die. Your character can die, but they call it being exhausted. You run out of health, because health does actually matter in this game. And when you do that, you'll find out what happens. There's a little bit of a storybook that you read, but you get a little bonus that will help you later in the game. And if both players die, you lose most of your XP that you've accumulated that round. And that stung a bit. We died, or we got exhausted 3 times. I think it was around like scenario 3 or 4 that happened, and we realized that we weren't playing as well as we should have. So part of that was definitely on us, and not trying to boost our health as much as we could have. But I can say it didn't feel good, and I think that's partially a good thing. It motivated us to play better and not die again in the future. But having all of our XP lost was rough. I will say that was pretty rough in the game because like we had those experiences. Like the XP represents experiences, like learning things about ourselves and about the world and about the game, and we lost most of that experience because of our exhaustion, and that didn't feel great. So I don't know, I'm kind of on the fence about that. Like I think it would have still not felt great to be exhausted or die in the game, even if that hadn't happened, but it was also a good motivation for us to make sure it didn't happen again. However, what we also realized is that we should have been resting a little bit more, because the game gives you a way to just rest. You can use some turns, not many turns, but sometimes the game says you can rest right now. But there's a consequence to that too, because whenever you rest, you are gaining back some of your health and stamina, or you're resetting all of your abilities. You have this big player mat. Let's see if I can show it to you. And this big player mat that is filled with little cubes that say, okay, your intelligence right now, you have 5 intelligence. And so if your intelligence level is 5, you get to refill back up to 5 intelligence cubes they can use throughout the game. And you get to refill that whenever you rest. And you also replenish your health a little bit. But you have to spend XP to do that. And so there's a nice push and pull there. Like I think I've heard some people say this game is too easy because you can rest that often. We didn't mind that, and we did feel a sense of sacrifice whenever we rested, because we were like, okay, we are sacrificing this XP that we'd rather use for something else. to progress ourselves in the game, but instead we had to use that XP to rest in the scenario. So I think the difficulty level was the right level for us, because we were a little bit more focused on all the other stuff in the game and didn't really care that much about exactly optimizing, basically. Optimization was not our main priority in terms of when we rested and all that. The next category I want to talk about is consequences. And if you notice in the background that suddenly this room has changed a little bit, it's because I'm filming the second half of this video at a slightly different time. Same day as the earlier video, but same shirt, as you can tell. But so the consequences and the impact of your actions in role-player adventures are one of the things that impresses me the most about the game, and I view this as highly difficult to replicate in another game because it's done so well here. I talked about it earlier about how the game is really good at remembering things. Like you have you do something and you have a title card associated with what you did. You also gain, so those run over from scenario to scenario. They're there for the entire campaign. Also, within each individual chapter of the game, you have keywords that you write down, and you know that those keywords only impact you for that scenario. And so those keywords have consequences. So you might do something early in the scenario, and that comes back to bite you or help you later in that scenario based on what you did. And so that's short-term consequences. Then you have the long-term consequences related to these title cards. And without spoiling anything, I can't go into details about how this works, but really, every decision you make, or almost every decision you make in this game, has long-term consequences. You will see characters pop up from one chapter to the next, and their relationship with you is dependent on choices that you've made regarding them in the past. There are certain keywords that come up in the setup section of the book of things that happen very early on in the campaign, and they could possibly impact you and even impact the setup of the game for the entire rest of the campaign. I'm so impressed by how these consequences are woven into the story and how they impact every step of the way. And one of the ways that they really come into play, especially the keywords that you have to write down within each scenario, is that you'll encounter something in the storybook. Again, I don't want to show it to you and spoil anything, but you'll encounter something in the storybook and it'll say, do you have keyword pizza? And if you have keyword pizza, you read a different passage. But if you don't, you go to the next line. You're told to read line by line. So if you don't, you go to the next one. It says, okay, if you have keyword ice sculpture, and then if you do, you'll go and look up a different passage. It'll give you another passage, and eventually it'll get just down to the default. And if you don't have any of those keywords, then you just read the passage as normal. So that's how it works in the game. But to have implemented that at the scale that they did in Roleplayer Adventures is incredible, especially over the entire campaign. And there's an impact on the finale. I don't want to spoil anything, but the things that you're doing matter throughout the campaign, and then in a big way in the finale, in a way that is just so impressive. And part of that ties to the thing that I want to say next, which is the system of favor and narrative in the game. So favor is what I'm referring to there is that there's a big sheet of paper that you have when you have the campaign out, and there's 3 different factions essentially that you can influence with your decisions over the course of the campaign. You might do something, the top one is King's Favor. And so you might do something that is good for the kingdom, and if you do that, your influence on the kingdom will increase. Your favor for how they favor you. If you do something bad against the kingdom, your favor for the kingdom will go down. And there are a couple different factions in those regards. And the thing that I really like about this, in addition to the consequences, is the shades of gray between these 3 different factions. There is no clear party that is correct about anything. Very similar, well, I know there's things in the real world that I feel strongly about, but you might feel strongly about them in a different way. What I say is objectively, morally, or ethically good might be different to you. And Roleplayer Adventures approaches those shades of gray in a really interesting way, in a way that I think is better done here than in any other fantasy game that I've played. Because in most fantasy games, if you encounter a troll or an orc, they are inherently bad, and all they want to do is kill you, and all you are allowed to do is kill them. But not so in Roleplayer Adventures. You have the skill checks. You can interact with these different characters in different ways. And also, Roleplayer Adventures tells you about these orcs and these trolls and these characters that are typically treated as inherently evil. And you have other choices you can make with them. You can befriend them potentially. You can treat them with kindness. You can learn their story. You can try to understand their language and learn where they're coming from. The game is written, this favor system and how it relates to the game and the narrative is written in such a compassionate, I'll say inclusive, and really beautiful way that I think elevates role-player adventures over any other fantasy game where there are creatures that are inherently evil who only want to kill you and all you can do to them is kill them. I won't name names here about other games that do that because I know there are games where you just want to sit down and you just want to shoot stuff. There are video games designed around that concept. Somehow that taps into our human nature. But role-player adventures goes deeper into that concept and adds a bunch of shades of gray and gives you the choice to align with creatures that are typically treated as evil. And I think that is amazing. Both not just as a player, as a player of this game, but also as a human being. And also, the writing, I mentioned narrative here. The writing is fantastic. The writer is James Ryan. I believe James Ryan wrote most of this game. I'm sure Keith had an impact on that as well. But I thought the writing was great. The passages weren't too long. And so you're reading through this passage. There is a fair amount of reading, but they're not too long. They don't overstay their welcome. And there's a lot of good humor to the passages. A lot of the best of it is found in the item system, which I'll describe below. But yeah, it's a really, really well-written story game, which I think is important if you're going to have a storybook in a game. The next category, we're on number, what is this? They're not ranked, but I think this is number 7, are items and familiars. So there are lots of different items in the game that you can gain, that you can acquire, different cards essentially. But what I'm talking about specifically are items related to each individual scenario. These have their own deck. I don't know if I can find them easily here, but there's this separate deck of item cards. Yeah, they're in the discovery card deck, where I'll show you one of them. This isn't a spoiler because you won't know what it is, and that's part of the point of it. Here's card number 78. So at some point in the campaign, you might be told, okay, you have discovered this card number 78. And you'll go get this card and you'll put it on the table and you realize there's no text here. You don't know what this thing does. You don't know what this lead medallion does. Sometimes you can intuit what it does a little bit. So if it's, yeah, I don't want to spoil anything, but if it's like a shovel, you can intuit that, hey, I'll probably use this to dig at some point. But in that lead medallion, you don't know what that's used for. You don't know whose lead medallion that is. And I love that text isn't on the card to tell you what it is because you don't know. You pick up an object in this foreign world or a world that's foreign to you, and you are trying to learn what it does and whose is it and what it means. And so I love that there's no text on it. Instead, it adds creativity to the game because it means that you get to learn about that item throughout the chapter, throughout that specific chapter, by talking to people about what that might be, what that might mean. You have to pay attention to the narrative. That's why the narrative is so important. You have to actually pay attention to it to see how this actually works. And at certain points, the storybook might say, use an item, or you can use an item right now. You don't need to. At that point, you might look up item number 78. So you'll look in that chapter for number 78 and see, can I use it here? Does it do anything? And oftentimes, this is where the humor comes in the writing. Oftentimes, it just says, no, there's nothing you can do here. You look a little odd right now because you're trying to use the lead medallion in a keyhole to a door. Doesn't make sense. And the book will kind of make fun of you for trying that. But other times, there are ways that you can use it. And one of the coolest things about this is that you can combine items. So I mentioned that shovel earlier, and you might have, I don't know what else you would have there, but sometimes you can combine items to do something cool. In the rulebook, the example they gave is that you might combine a shield with a lighter, a matchstick, to light a fire when there's heavy wind around. And so you have to intuit that. The cards don't tell you can combine them that way. You have to intuit that, and then you look so if the shield in that instance is card number 18 and the matchstick is card number 24, you would look up 18.24 in that chapter of the storybook, and it would tell you, hey, look, you did it. You're started a fire in a time where you normally wouldn't be able to start a fire. Whereas if you only went to passage 24, it would say the wind is too strong right now. You can't start this fire. So really, really clever system. And I have one little piece of feedback about it, and one thing that I want to say that I think is great about it, which is the great part is that these item cards that you're gaining that you can use in this way are specific to the chapter. They're in the discovery card deck. So it's not an overwhelming amount of information. It means that every chapter you have a few cards that you've gained throughout that chapter that you might be able to use in a special way in that chapter. But you can't use after that. I mean, just notice how on the screen how washed out I am right now. I think it's this lighting at nighttime. Sorry about that if I look crazy weird right now. Yeah, so I like that those items are limited to that specific chapter. Otherwise, it would be an overwhelming amount of information, and it would be so much storybook text. The one downside I found to this system, as cool as it is that I never wanted to miss an opportunity to use an item. And so we would use our creativity. We would say, okay, what can we use right now? Are there any of these items that we can use? But we would often just look in the storybook to see, okay, this is what happens when we do it. And so some of the items have a cost, like you're supposed to spend a stamina to use an item. And oftentimes we wouldn't do that because we just didn't want to miss out on the opportunity of using an item. And I think one of the reasons for that is that because it was so easy to look up that information. We didn't have to go to a separate book. We didn't have to load up an app, things like that. And so I'm a little bit on the fence about how if this system is designed as best as it could, or if there's another way to do it to prevent players from kind of cheating in the way that we did. And I'm not sure. Because I love the element of creativity and discovery and using items at the right time, but I want to balance that with giving meaning to when you actually try to use that item. I don't know, and I think it's actually fine here. I think I would almost recommend that you play the way that we did and just use the items whenever you want. Don't worry about paying the stamina, but I don't know. I'm curious about your thoughts about that in particular. Let's see if I mixed anything else here. No, I didn't miss anything. Okay, the next category is items and familiars. I actually think I'm a little behind here. No, the other part of this category is familiars. Yes. So the familiars are another element of the game that I thought was maybe a little bit underused. Let's see if I can find them. Yeah, I can't find them right now. But there are a bunch of new dice that you can use in the game. So most of the dice in the game are standard D6 dice, and they're one color. The familiars are these creatures that you can encounter during the campaign, and they each have a die associated with them. And I just thought it was a really clever system. It's from a previous expansion for role player, but they're two color dice, still standard D6 dice. And the really cool design element that I thought about them is that they each come with a card, and during a skill test or a combat, you can call upon that familiar to come help you, and you can dig around in the bag and find the die and roll it right away. However, those dice are kept in the bag of dice, and so the familiar dice are any familiar that you've gained is in this bag of dice. And so it means that there are times where when you're randomly drawing dice at the beginning of a skill test, you are going to draw a familiar. And it's a really nice feel-good moment because it means that you haven't had to use that card to get the familiar. You've essentially gotten it for free. And it's like you've had a little friend show up to help you out. I think that's really cool. So I just like that mechanism of adding a die to the game, and the die goes into a random pool. So sometimes you can just luck out and gain that die. But if you don't, you can call upon that familiar to come help you at the right time. All right, number 8. Progression and cooperation. So I won't talk about this too much. I think there's a ton of cooperation in this game. You are really working together with the other players to solve these skill test and combat challenges, but also you're talking together quite a bit about the narrative and which decisions you want to make and which factions you want to gain favor with and which ones you want to ignore, which paths you want to take in each story. I think there's a lot of discussion level cooperation, which I think is often overlooked in games. Like that is a huge element of actual cooperation in real life, like discussing what is the right thing to do in this moment with limited information. So I think that's a great element of cooperation. Also, you progress as a group, which I think is really, really cool for the most part. So when at the end of each scenario, you have the option to buy more cards, which you spend the group's money to do that. You don't have your own money, it's the group's money. And you can also level up your characters using XP. Or level up the group, really. You can level up the characters a little bit, but it really doesn't end up impacting your character more than the next person's character all that much. Really, the core level ups are how many extra cards you can play, the bonus plays, and how many dice you can draw at the beginning of combat. are those are the things that you can level up over the course of the campaign by spending XP, which makes XP matter, and you do that as a group. Those are group things that impact you as a group. And so I love that the progression is on the level of the group and not the character so much. There's a little bit of character level progression, and maybe there could have been a little bit more, but I like that the focus was on the group, that you're moving together as a party, making decisions together as a party, and progressing as a party as well. 2 more categories here. I know this is a long video. Thank you for sticking with it. So the second to last category are maps, scenario design, and campaign length. A couple different things I want to mention here. So at the beginning of each scenario, you pull out a map. Let me find one of those maps, the starter map. So the first map you have is this one. Harder to pull out than I thought. So this is the starter map. This is the one that you start on. Beautiful, beautiful art, by the way. Really beautiful art. I think they could have gone with a storybook, but I don't mind this system of having a map. They feel really nice. Really nice paper was used for this. And you just put this on the table. And this is the map that you use during that scenario. And the thing I really like about the maps is that you can modify them while you play. So at a certain point in the game, this is a random example, not true to this scenario at all, but you might discover that there's like something hidden in this forest down here. And when you do, the game will say, go get discovery card 25, and you'll put that card here, and it'll align with the art. There's a grid here. You probably can't see it all that well, but you can put that card here. It aligns with the grid, and that card permanently modifies this part of the map. I think that's a really cool way to modify a map without requiring stickers. This is not a legacy game. Also, scenarios are super easy to set up. All you do is you put this map on the table, you open the scenario book, and it walks you through the instructions. And the instructions are really like, it says, put an XP on each location and put a random encounter token on a few different slots here. And then you're ready to go. That's it. That's it. Especially if you've left it on the table and you already have your character cards on the table. But I really like how fast each scenario is to set up. It makes the game a lot more accessible that way. Each scenario felt really unique to me, but not in that some scenarios had like slightly different rules, so they would tweak a little thing. But I like that most of the scenarios just were the core rules of the game, and the different feel of each scenario came from the map and the encounters and the stories, the things that you encounter in the story, like the things that you're actually doing, the people that you're encountering, the creatures you're encountering, the things that you're actually doing made each scenario feel unique. The maps tie me into each scenario visually. Like even when I was cleaning up the campaign, I was reminiscing about what we did along the way, and the maps were helpful for that, as were the title cards. But the overarching idea here is that I like that each scenario felt unique because of the core elements that were there throughout the game, not because of a huge change of rule in each scenario. But they still felt highly replayable, and this ties into the length of the campaign, because the campaign is 11 games long, and I think that is just about right for the length of the campaign. I did not want a 100-game campaign out of this. I didn't want a 20-game campaign out of it, and this is my favorite game of the year. 11 games, I would say somewhere between 10 to 12, even 9 to 12 would have been great for this, because the game didn't overstay its welcome. I never played a scenario and was like, oh, I feel like I just played that scenario. Like I'm not just fighting a slightly different group of monsters with a slightly different map. Each map is very different in the story it tells, and each storybook, scenario book, is very different as well. And I don't think they could have replicated that 20 times. I think it would have started to feel repetitive. Whereas they told a tighter story. It's like having a great movie instead of like The Hobbit. Here's an example. It's like the book The Hobbit instead of the movies The Hobbit, where one book that probably could have been one movie, maybe two movies, is spread out over 3 movies, then starts to feel repetitive. There's just too much of it there. So I really like that length. The game is expensive. It's $150, I believe. But getting 25 hours of cinema level experience out of this game for that much money, and it's a game now that I can pass on to another friend and they can play it, I think it was totally worth the money for me. So again, I really like the campaign length. I think sometimes we forget about campaign length. We think more is better. But in all the research I've done about campaigns, I think around 10 to 15 games is really the sweet spot for it. Once you get beyond that, even though it's cool to know that you have all that stuff, it's almost daunting to feel like you have to get through it. Rather, instead, we were told a really great, tight story in Role Player Adventures. The final category I want to talk about is how endings matter. And I don't know if I'll finish this video with a strong ending, but every scenario in Role Player Adventures ends strong. It ends with a bang. It ends with a big final scene that you remember. And I like that. I like that it builds up to something. Each scenario builds up to something. And there's a point in each scenario where, or in most scenarios, where it says, okay, if you move into this next room, you are entering what we will call the end. Like, this is the end of the scenario. You can't turn back after this. Not every scenario does this, but I like the heads up in certain scenarios where it kind of is just telling you, if there's more that you want to do in this world, you are welcome to do that. In fact, in many scenarios, just say, you are eligible now to go to the end whenever you're ready. But if you're not ready, that's okay. You can still walk around and explore. Maybe you didn't have to, maybe you reached the end, but you never spent much time in the Goblin Camp. Feel free to go back to the Goblin Camp. It's okay. I like that the game gives you the freedom to do that. It's not an open world game. Like, you are constricted to this map, and the campaign is linear. But I like that each scenario gives you a little bit of freedom before you go to the end to explore a little bit more if you want to. And then when you get to the end, I've talked about, how the end reminds you of the things that you've already done in that campaign or in that scenario. Also about the end, though, the final scenario of the game is called the finale, I think. It's chapters 1 through 10 and then the finale. And it is truly an amazing finale. It reminded me, not necessarily thematically, but I won't say not necessarily thematically, but it reminded me of the Infinity War, like the two final movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that we know so far. How everything built up to this huge moment, and you see characters come in from throughout the entire campaign. Decisions that you've made throughout the entire campaign come into play for a big cinematic scenario. It is truly incredible, and so I love that the game had these big finales within each scenario, and over at the end of the campaign, you had a big finale as well. I think ending strong matters in these campaign games and in these scenario-driven games. I think the ending of it has a big impact on how you will remember that scenario or how you remember that campaign. All right, I've now waxed poetic about Role Player Adventures for a good 40 minutes now. Thank you for sticking with me for this video. It's been a lot of fun to talk about this game. I truly love this game, and I hope you have the chance to experience it, and I hope you love it. If you don't love it, that's okay too. But I really, given how much I love it, I hope you love it too. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you do have a spoiler you want to discuss, that's fine. Just preface it with a big spoiler warning. And I look forward to hearing what you have, what your thoughts are, whether or not you've played Role Player, but how these things that I talk about that I really appreciate about this game and what I debated and tried to learn from might impact other cooperative adventure games in the future as well. Thanks.